At 7:52 on a cold March morning in 1988, Florennes Air Base in Belgium stirred awake under a sky muted by low clouds, the kind of quiet, colorless dawn that made the metallic silhouettes of the F-16 Fighting Falcons seem almost serene. Mechanics walked the flight line with clipboards tucked under their arms, their breath forming pale clouds as they carried out routine checks. Nothing about the scene suggested that this morning would diverge from any other in the base's long operational history. Routine is deceptive that way. It convinces even the most disciplined crews that the world is predictable. And in aviation, that illusion is often the birthplace of disaster. The F-16A parked outside its hardened shelter, designated for a standard training mission, sat with its canopy open and cockpit exposed. It was a machine built for speed, designed to obey the smallest movement of a pilot's hand, crafted to respond instantly to intention. But at this moment, it was still and quiet, its systems awaiting the ritual that would bring them to life. The pilot assigned to this flight, an experienced Belgian Air Force captain, approached the aircraft with the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this thousands of times. That confidence, however, carried an invisible weight. Familiarity with a task doesn't eliminate danger. It dilutes respect for it. He climbed the metal ladder to the cockpit while two technicians finished routine visual checks on the aircraft's exterior. They exchanged a few words, mundane, casual, reflective of a normal start to the day. The captain settled into the Ace's 2 ejection seat, the very system engineered to save lives in the worst possible scenarios. Its explosive cartridges were ready, its harness designed to lock him securely in place, and its handles positioned where the pilot could reach them instinctively under extreme stress. But instinct has an unfortunate shadow, inadvertence. As the captain began adjusting his straps, shifting his weight, and organizing his workspace, his hand brushed near the ejection handle. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible contact. Yet inside the mechanisms of that handle lived enough stored energy to override the entire sequence of a normal flight. In aviation, there are moments so small that they barely exist, and yet they decide everything. Without warning, a violent crack split the air. The ejection cartridge detonated with a force that transformed stillness into chaos. The canopy shattered upward, its fragments catching the weak light as they scattered. In less than 0.2 of a second, the pilot was ripped from the cockpit, the explosive charge thrusting him into the sky with brutal precision. Technicians nearby dropped to the ground as the deafening blast overwhelmed their senses. For an instant, no one understood what had happened. Then, as they saw the captain suspended beneath a rapidly deploying parachute, disbelief turned into dread. Because the aircraft he left behind was no longer a harmless shape on a cold runway. It was alive. The F-16's engine, already powered and stabilizing in preparation for taxi, remained throttled enough to keep the jet creeping forward. With no pilot in the seat, no brakes engaged, and no canopy to obstruct airflow, the aircraft began to move. At first, it rolled slowly, wobbling slightly as though confused by its own animation. But a jet engine does not question its purpose. It follows physics, and physics has no time for shock. Technicians sprinted toward the aircraft, waving their arms, shouting commands at a machine that could not hear them. The F-16 continued to roll, its path deceptively straight, guided only by the direction of its nose wheel and the contours of the concrete beneath it. The crew chiefs knew the truth instantly. No human could get in front of that aircraft without being pulled into the intake or struck by the airframe. Intervention was impossible. The jet crept toward the taxiway, gathering speed as the engine output stabilized into a steady hum. The mechanics watched helplessly as the aircraft crossed lines painted on the pavement, lines meant to guide trained pilots, not a runaway fighter jet. The base's safety protocols had never considered a scenario like this. An aircraft moving under its own power without a pilot, accelerating through a maze of hardened shelters and service roads. Within seconds, it aligned almost perfectly with the runway. Those who witnessed the sight later struggled to describe it. It was surreal, disturbing, like watching a living creature whose soul had been suddenly removed, leaving only mechanical instinct behind. The jet's nose lifted subtly as aerodynamic forces took hold. The aircraft, lightened without the weight of a pilot and canopy, responded eagerly to the airflow rushing beneath its wings. Onlookers realized what was happening just as the jet's wheels began to skip lightly on the pavement. Then, with a smoothness that defied the terror of the situation, the F-16 left the ground. For a moment, time seemed to distort. A fighter aircraft was airborne with no one inside it, climbing steadily like a ghost fulfilling muscle memory. The tower controllers stared in disbelief. The flight line froze. Even the captain, drifting downward under his parachute, saw the impossible. His aircraft, designed to obey his commands, now flying without him across the Belgian countryside. Aviation is built on layers of control, pilots, procedures, redundancy, checklists. But once the aircraft lifts off, only physics remains. Without a person at the controls, the F-16 was governed solely by trim settings, power levels, and the aerodynamic balance of its design. It climbed shallowly at first, then began to drift into an unsteady arc. No one could predict how far it would travel. An F-16 with even modest thrust can travel dozens of kilometers before losing critical stability. Inside the control tower, alarms were triggered. Emergency protocols activated across the base. Notifications were sent to Belgian authorities warning of a potentially catastrophic impact if the jet descended over a populated area. Officers realized the full magnitude of the threat. A combat aircraft had effectively become a runaway projectile with no guidance and no intention. The captain touched the ground roughly a few minutes later, shaken but alive. Medical personnel ran to him, shouting questions, checking his injuries, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon where the jet had disappeared. He knew exactly what was happening inside that cockpit. Nothing. No hands on the stick. No feet on the pedals. No mind interpreting airflow or correcting pitch oscillations. The aircraft was continuing on inertia, design, and luck. Finally, after several long minutes, the jet's unstable flight path deteriorated. The nose dipped. The right wing dropped. The aircraft began a descending spiral, the aerodynamic struggle turning into a death spin. In the distance, a sudden plume of smoke erupted as the F-16 slammed into a remote field. The shockwave rippled outward, but there were no civilian casualties. The earth absorbed the violence, leaving behind a crater and twisted metal fragments. Back at the base, the silence after the impact was almost as jarring as the chaos that preceded it. The crew on the ground tried to process what they had just seen, a sequence of events so improbable that it felt like fiction. But it wasn't fiction. It was a vivid demonstration of how the smallest lapse, the briefest moment of distraction, can unravel the safeguards of even the most advanced systems. At the crash site, smoke curled upward in a gray column, rising quietly into the morning sky as emergency crews sped across rural roads toward the wreckage. The impact had torn the aircraft apart instantly, scattering debris across the muddy field. Flames crackled at the edges of the fractured fuselage, fed by residual fuel. There was no cockpit to search, no pilot to rescue. Only the haunting sight of a fighter jet reduced to twisted alloy. The responders moved cautiously, stunned by the sheer violence of a crash involving an aircraft that, minutes earlier, had been rolling idly on a runway without a soul inside it. What struck many of them was the eerie contradiction: a state-of-the-art combat machine, engineered for precision and dominance in the skies, brought down not by enemy fire or mechanical failure, but by a single unintentional human action in the moments before takeoff. Back at Florennes Air Base, the immediate focus shifted from the smoking crater to the profound implications of what had occurred. An F-16 had not merely crashed, it had launched itself into flight from a standing start with no pilot at the controls. The magnitude of that reality settled heavily on the officers now gathering in the operations building. A fighter jet with live fuel, sophisticated avionics, and enough thrust to outrun nearly anything in the air had escaped the structured environment of the base and crossed miles of Belgian airspace without guidance. The scenario exposed a vulnerability that none of the existing manuals or emergency protocols had ever envisioned. The captain, now seated in the base hospital with a blanket over his shoulders, struggled to process the chain of events as investigators began asking questions. His ejection had not been triggered by panic or confusion. It had not been the result of turbulence or imminent impact. It had occurred on the ground, with the aircraft stationary because he had inadvertently engaged the ejection mechanism while settling into the cockpit. The explosive charge beneath him had done its job flawlessly, and in doing so, it had set off a crisis that pushed the boundaries of aviation safety into uncharted territory. Technicians who had been near the aircraft at the moment of ejection described their shock. Several admitted they initially believed the blast was a maintenance accident or even an attack. None had imagined that a seated pilot could be launched upward during routine pre-flight tasks. Their instincts had forced them to the ground in the split second after the detonation. When they looked up and saw the captain suspended under a parachute, relief came first, relief that he was alive. Only afterward did the second wave hit. The aircraft, no longer anchored by its pilot, was taxiing away. The adrenaline of that moment still pulsed through their voices. One mechanic recounted how he sprinted after the moving jet, fully aware he had no way to stop it. Another described the fear of being sucked into the intake if he got too close, a threat lethal enough that he stopped his pursuit after only a few seconds. They watched helplessly as the airplane rolled, straightened, and, almost impossibly, lifted off the runway as though answering a silent command. To the base leadership, this incident exposed a terrifying reality. A modern fighter jet could become a runaway weapon simply through the interaction of unintended human input and the aircraft's natural aerodynamic capability. The F-16's powerful engine, low weight without a pilot and canopy, and efficient wing design made it capable of flying even under the most uncontrolled circumstances. It did not need a deliberate push to leave the ground. It merely needed thrust and alignment, conditions that the chaos of the morning had unintentionally provided. As communications flowed between military headquarters, air safety authorities, and Belgian civil agencies, the concern shifted from the immediate consequences to the broader implications. What had happened was not simply an accident. It was a breakdown in cockpit resource management, procedural discipline, and system safeguards. The pilot had entered the aircraft during a phase when distractions were rampant. He was focused on seat adjustments, pre-flight checks, and coordination with ground crew, tasks that require full attention. But the environment around him, a mixture of routine familiarity and subtle time pressure, introduced a cognitive vulnerability. In aviation, distraction is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, ordinary, and almost invisible until the moment it alters everything. Even more troubling was the absence of any mechanical interlock preventing an accidental ejection on the ground. The Ace's two-seat was a marvel of engineering, designed to save pilots during catastrophic failures in flight. But it was also sensitive, reactive, and fully armed as soon as the pilot engaged the necessary safety procedures. The idea that a momentary, unintended movement could activate it exposed a weakness in ergonomic design. Cockpits in military fighters are cramped, with critical handles placed within reach for survival purposes. That necessity creates inherent risks that become amplified when pilots operate under even mild distraction or incomplete situational focus. When the initial shock passed, the investigators began reconstructing the timeline of events, tracing each action, each movement, each environmental factor that contributed to the chain reaction. They analyzed the path the aircraft traveled across the base, studying the slight variations in direction that finally placed it in perfect alignment for takeoff. They evaluated the throttle position and engine response, noting how the jet's systems continued functioning precisely as designed, completely unaware that the person who should have guided them was no longer present. The human factor in this incident was not a matter of incompetence. It was a mixture of routine, environmental cues, ergonomics, and the inherent complexity of operating a high-performance machine. The captain had followed procedures hundreds of times before, each repetition reinforcing a sense of control. But the margin for error in a fighter cockpit is measured not in centimeters, but in millimeters. When a pilot's hand drifts a fraction too far, when posture shifts unexpectedly, when gloves catch on a handle instead of a harness strap, entire systems can react with irreversible force. In the aftermath, military psychologists highlighted an uncomfortable truth. Even the most experienced pilots are susceptible to small cognitive slips, especially in repetitive environments. The brain often substitutes habit for vigilance, compressing steps into automatic motions. When that occurs near a control as sensitive as the ejection handle, The risk becomes invisible until it detonates, literally. Outside the base, public curiosity intensified. News outlets across Europe portrayed the event as both bizarre and alarming. The image of a fighter jet flying without a pilot captured the imagination of civilians, many of whom had never considered how tightly pilots and aircraft must coordinate to maintain safety. Headlines described the F-16 as a runaway jet, a ghost plane, a pilotless missile. The narratives were dramatic, but the underlying reality was even more unsettling. An advanced combat aircraft had demonstrated how quickly an unplanned chain of events could override human control. Within military aviation circles, the incident became an instant case study. Discussions erupted around how ejection systems were armed, how checklists addressed cockpit entry, how maintenance teams coordinated with pilots during pre-flight, and how bases should respond if another aircraft ever began to move without a pilot. There were no easy answers. The systems had worked as designed. The personnel had behaved as trained. And yet the combination of these elements had produced a scenario no one had anticipated. The investigators questioned the captain extensively once he had recovered from the shock. He explained each step he took before the ejection, searching for the precise moment when the chain reaction began. His recollection was clear. He had been adjusting his harness and preparing for the next item in the checklist when he felt a sudden jolt. His training had conditioned him to trust the ejection sequence implicitly, so even in those impossible milliseconds, instinct took over. But as soon as he saw the ground falling away beneath him, it became clear that something unprecedented was unfolding. He never lost consciousness, and as he descended, he saw the unimaginable sight of his own aircraft rolling away without him. That image stayed with him long after he landed. The idea that a weapon system designed to amplify his skill could operate independently, even momentarily, was profoundly unsettling. He knew that if the aircraft had veered left instead of right, or if its wheels had caught on uneven pavement, the outcome could have been catastrophically different. The jet might have collided with fuel trucks, maintenance crews, or other parked aircraft. It might have exploded on the flight line. Instead, it had taxied, aligned, accelerated, and taken off as though following a silent rehearsal. The High Command recognized the severity of those possibilities. A formal inquiry was launched, and safety boards convened to examine both the technical and procedural aspects of the incident. They approached the case meticulously, combing through maintenance logs, interviewing personnel, testing cockpit ergonomics, and analyzing the physics of the jet's unintended takeoff. Their task was not simply to explain what had happened, but to ensure that nothing like it could ever happen again. The inquiry teams moved swiftly, assembling specialists in flight safety, human factors, engineering, and military operations. Their immediate mandate was clear: reconstruct, with absolute precision, the sequence that had allowed a frontline combat aircraft to transform into an unguided, airborne hazard. They began by analyzing what remained of the wreckage. The fragments offered crucial clues: engine components that showed signs of normal operation until impact, control surfaces that bore no evidence of mechanical failure, and avionics modules that, despite being damaged on impact, revealed no anomalies. The aircraft had behaved exactly as the laws of aerodynamics dictated. Its destruction had come not from malfunction, but from the absence of human control. Next, investigators turned their attention to the cockpit environment. They examined the ACE's two ejection seat, reviewing its design, trigger sensitivity, and placement within the cramped confines of the F-16. The handle's shape and position were intentionally optimized to be reachable during high-stress emergencies. But that accessibility also meant that a gloved hand, fumbling during strap adjustments or attempting to stabilize body weight, could inadvertently apply pressure. Investigators sat in the seat themselves, replicating the posture and movements described by the captain, noting how easy it was for a minor shift in balance to bring the pilot's hand dangerously close to the ejection mechanism. Human factors specialists raised a critical question: had years of repetition reduced the pilot's cognitive engagement during pre-flight routines? The more the mind identifies a task as familiar, the more it automates it, replacing active thought with muscle memory. In complex systems, this mental shortcut can be fatal. A pilot who has strapped into an aircraft hundreds of times can, paradoxically, become more vulnerable to distraction during the simplest steps. The investigation began to focus on whether complacency, rather than negligence, had played the decisive role. Interviews with mechanics and crew chiefs shed further light on the environment. They described the morning as ordinary, steady workflow, predictable tasks, no unusual delays or pressures. The calmness of that environment, paradoxically, may have contributed to the captain's momentary lapse. Distraction doesn't always come from chaos. It often arises from monotony. The technicians recalled the captain adjusting his gear while casually acknowledging their final checks. No one sensed anything amiss. The chain of errors was invisible until the explosion made it undeniable. At the same time, procedural analysts reviewed the checklists and protocols governing cockpit entry and pre-flight preparation. The procedures were thorough, but they assumed that pilots would maintain continuous situational awareness inside the cockpit. That assumption ignored the reality of human cognitive limits. There was no redundancy or systematic reminder to ensure that the pilot remained conscious of the ejection handle's proximity during early cockpit tasks. This gap became a focal point. The environment provided no safety net to catch a moment of inadvertent contact. Attention then shifted to the aircraft's unpiloted movement. Data on the runway's surface, slope, and environmental conditions were studied to understand how the jet had accelerated. The concrete was level but slightly wet from the night's drizzle. This reduced friction just enough to let the F-16 roll more freely once the engine produced stable thrust. Engineers pulled engine performance logs to estimate how quickly the jet would have reached a flight-sustaining speed given the throttle setting. Their conclusions were sobering. Even modest thrust, combined with the jet's aerodynamic efficiency, could easily allow liftoff if the aircraft achieved correct alignment. That alignment was perhaps the most chilling detail. The F-16 had not meandered unpredictably across the airbase. It had moved in a nearly straight line, passing through a narrow corridor between shelters and equipment, following a path that seemed almost intentional. Investigators walked the route, understanding how even minor variations could have led to devastation. Fuel storage areas, maintenance huts, crews working in open hangars. A deviation of only a few degrees could have caused an explosion large enough to kill dozens. The jet's unintended precision was the product of chance, not purpose, a reminder of how thin the line is between an anomaly and a catastrophe. The psychological component of the investigation was just as comprehensive. Analysts examined how the captain's experience level could both protect and endanger him. Experience provides confidence, but confidence can distort perception, leading to momentary blind spots. They evaluated his mental state, stress levels, sleep patterns, and workload in the days preceding the incident. Nothing indicated fatigue or emotional distress. The event was not the product of an overwhelmed mind. It was the result of an ordinary mind performing a familiar task. Crash investigators reconstructed the moment of ejection in detail. They mapped the trajectory of the seat and canopy fragments using physics models and testimony from witnesses. They confirmed that the pilot had been launched at full ejection force, the system performing exactly as designed. That accuracy saved his life but created an unprecedented hazard. When the pilot was expelled, the seat separation sequence executed flawlessly, allowing him to descend by parachute. Yet that same perfection left the aircraft intact and operational. A paradoxical reminder that safety systems are not always isolated. They interact with the broader environment in unpredictable ways. The inquiry moved next to evaluate the base's emergency response. The alarm sequence, communications, and coordination showed efficiency, but the lack of a protocol for unpiloted aircraft rendered the response reactive rather than strategic. They noted that personnel had quickly warned civil authorities, but the window for interception was too narrow. There were no air assets immediately available to engage or divert the runaway jet. Even if there had been, shooting down an unpiloted F-16 over populated terrain would introduce new risks. The base's leadership recognized that, under only slightly different circumstances, the incident could have triggered a national emergency. A key revelation emerged when investigators studied the throttle and engine configuration at the moment of ejection. The aircraft had been in an intermediate power setting typical for pre-flight warm-up. Without weight on the seat sensors and without manual brake input, Nothing prevented the aircraft from creeping forward. That simple mechanical truth underscored the fragility of ground control procedures. The safety board began drafting recommendations to prevent similar occurrences. Brake interlocks that remain active until pilots confirm cockpit readiness. Engine idle thresholds designed to limit unintended motion, and modifications to checklists that emphasize early control checks. As the investigation expanded, attention shifted to the broader implications for military aviation. The idea that a jet could unintentionally take off without a pilot forced a reassessment of how fighter aircraft interact with human operators on the ground. It challenged assumptions about procedural robustness and exposed vulnerabilities in cockpit design. An ejection handle must be easy to reach during emergencies, but too easy to reach during routine operations presents its own threat. Ergonomics teams reviewed the handle's shape, placement, and amount of force required to initiate the sequence. Although compliant with design standards, it was evident that the proximity to areas frequently accessed during pre-flight created an unacceptable risk vector. Simulations were conducted using other F-16s to determine the replicability of the runway roll. Under controlled conditions, jets with similar power settings behaved in comparable ways. If brakes were disengaged and no pilot input stabilized the aircraft, it would slowly move forward. The runway's straight geometry made alignment incredibly likely. As speed increased, the aircraft naturally sought aerodynamic equilibrium, producing lift. These tests reinforced the conclusion that the morning's events, though extraordinary, were not freak accidents. They were the natural outcome of a misaligned interplay of human factors and machine behavior. Military leaders realized that this incident would become a landmark case in aviation safety education. Training programs began integrating the event into their coursework, using it as an example of how even the best technology cannot compensate for a momentary lapse in human attention. Flight schools across NATO countries referenced the case as a reminder of the critical importance of cockpit awareness, procedural discipline, and the constant vigilance required around ejection systems. Meanwhile, engineers considered ways to introduce safeguards preventing activation of the ejection sequence on the ground unless specific conditions were met. Ideas range from mechanical interlocks to weight-based sensors and arming switches. But integrating such features into existing aircraft would require significant redesigns, and altering the ejection mechanism risked delaying life-saving activation in emergencies. The balance between accessibility and safety proved more complex than many anticipated. The human dimension of the investigation deepened as psychologists continued working with the captain. He wrestled with the knowledge that his inadvertent action had caused the loss of an aircraft and placed lives at risk. Although the inquiry made clear that he had not acted recklessly, the weight of the event bore down on him. He replayed his cockpit entry in his mind repeatedly, recalling the subtle posture shift, the minor adjustment, the tiny moment when his hand grazed near the handle. That fragment of time felt stretched and distorted in retrospect, as if it carried an inevitable gravity. The investigators emphasized that the purpose was not to assign blame, but to extract lessons powerful enough to reshape safety protocols across multiple air forces. Through weeks of reconstruction, simulation, and analysis, the investigative team gradually pieced together a comprehensive narrative. A convergence of ordinary actions had created extraordinary consequences. A trained pilot entering his aircraft, a moment of mild distraction, a sensitive ejection mechanism responding exactly as engineered, a jet engine producing steady thrust, a runway designed to channel aircraft forward. Physics, procedure, environment, and human cognition had intersected at precisely the wrong moment. When the safety committee finalized its findings, the report would become one of the most important documents in European military aviation. But before they published it, they knew they still had to answer a deeper question, one that extended beyond the cause and effect mechanics of the morning's events. Why had the system, in its entirety, allowed a single moment to escalate into a full-fledged airborne emergency? In the days that followed, the question echoed through every meeting room, every debriefing session, every hallway where officers exchanged uneasy glances. How could such a small and unintended action cascade into a crisis that placed air crews, civilians, and national security at risk? The response required more than a technical explanation. It demanded a forensic dissection of how humans interact with machines under conditions that blend routine with high stakes. And for the investigation team, that meant revisiting the morning of the incident not as a chain of mechanical events, but as a living system of behaviors, perceptions, and vulnerabilities. They began by reframing the cockpit not as a technological space, but as a cognitive environment. In the F-16, every design choice, from the angle of the seat to the placement of the throttle, served a purpose tied to efficiency under extreme conditions. But these same choices also created friction points where human error could surface without warning. The ejection handle, bright yellow and black, shaped like a wishbone, sat between the pilot's legs for rapid access during catastrophic failures. It was a triumph of survival engineering. Yet on that morning, survival engineering intersected with a moment of unconscious movement. The handle's location, while ideal for emergencies, magnified its risk in routine operations. Human factors specialists highlighted an uncomfortable reality. No procedural manual, no matter how detailed, can fully mitigate the limitations of human attention. Cognitive drift, small lapses that occur when the brain enters a semi-automatic state, was not a flaw exclusive to pilots. It existed in every profession. But in the cockpit of a supersonic aircraft, the consequences were magnified exponentially. As the investigation team mapped out the incident, it became increasingly clear that the system had relied too heavily on the assumption that pilots would maintain perfect vigilance during all phases of flight preparation. The inquiry also examined communication patterns between the captain and ground crew. Technicians had no reason to suspect that anything was out of the ordinary. Their focus was on external checks, fuel levels, and mechanical readiness, not cockpit posture. They relied on the pilot to manage internal cockpit controls, and he relied on them to manage the aircraft's physical condition. This division of labor, normally efficient, created a blind zone, a moment where neither side was aware that the conditions for an accidental ejection were aligning. No alarm sounded, no warning light flashed, no crew member saw the subtle misplacement of a hand. It was the kind of error that only becomes visible in hindsight. Meanwhile, military leaders studied the broader operational context. Fighter squadrons operate under a mixture of discipline and tempo, maintaining readiness while executing repetitive training cycles. Over time, routines that are essential for maintaining proficiency can also dull sensitivity to risk. The Belgian Air Force was not unique in this. Across NATO, pilots performed multiple sorties per week, often repeating the same pre-flight sequences until the steps felt like second nature. And that was the paradox. Mastery built confidence, but confidence, if unmonitored, nurtured complacency. Inside the investigation room, diagrams covered the walls, maps of the runway, cockpit schematics, aerodynamic graphs showing how the F-16 reached self-sustaining lift. A pattern emerged that no one could ignore. At every stage, the aircraft had done exactly what physics predicted it would do. It rolled, gained speed, aligned with the runway's geometry, and lifted off effortlessly. Nothing about its movement was miraculous or inexplicable. The extraordinary nature of the event came not from the jet's behavior, but from the absence of the one element it was designed to rely on above all others, the pilot. As analysts examined the crash footage and debris pattern, they noted that the aircraft had exhibited stability for longer than many expected. This forced another question. What if the crash site had been different? What if the jet had remained stable for a few minutes more, drifting toward a town or industrial zone? The potential for mass casualties was undeniable. The Belgian government quietly acknowledged the scale of the risk. They recognized the fine margin by which disaster had been avoided. The F-16 had fallen in an empty field only because atmospheric conditions, thrust, alignment, and structural dynamics happened to converge in a way that limited the aircraft's range. That fragile luck led investigators to examine the decision-making culture within the squadron. They reviewed training philosophy, risk communication, and the subtle pressures that pilots face to maintain tempo and readiness. None of these elements directly caused the accident, but collectively they created an ecosystem where a momentary distraction could slip through unchecked. Investigators were careful not to assign moral judgment. Instead, they sought insight. Why had no one considered the possibility of accidental ejection on the ground as a systemic risk? Why had no procedural safeguards been developed to prevent it? Engineers proposed ideas that, at first glance, seemed obvious. Weight sensors that detect when a pilot is fully seated before arming the ejection sequence. Cockpit interlocks requiring deliberate confirmation before activation, or warnings that trigger when the handle is touched under non-emergency conditions. But each solution carried trade-offs. The ejection mechanism must function instantly during life-threatening flight failures. Any additional barrier could cost a pilot his life in the air. Safety improvements on the ground could create dangers in the sky. This dilemma, how to improve safety without compromising survival, became the core challenge of the investigation. The ACES II seat was among the most respected ejection systems ever built. Its success rate in combat and accident scenarios was exceptional, but its strength was also its weakness. It was designed to respond immediately to human intention, without the ambiguity of digital checks or confirmations. A split second could separate life and death. The system's designers had never anticipated that the intention might be triggered unintentionally. As the investigation entered its later stages, attention turned to the captain. He had undergone psychological evaluations to assess trauma, cognitive clarity, and recollection. Investigators sat with him for hours, reconstructing the moment from his perspective. His testimony was consistent. He remembered adjusting his harness, leaning slightly forward, and reaching instinctively for stability as he settled into the seat. His hand may have brushed the handle, or perhaps the glove caught on it. The exact motion was uncertain, but its consequence was absolute. His voice carried the weight of reality. He understood that his actions had unintentionally triggered a chain reaction that placed an entire region at risk. Yet the investigative board emphasized that the purpose was not to assign personal blame. The captain was a highly trained professional who had behaved according to established norms. His experience did not prevent the incident. It created the illusion that the cockpit environment was benign during pre-flight. The board concluded that no individual error in isolation could explain the magnitude of the event. Instead, it was the interaction of human factors, cockpit ergonomics, procedural assumptions, and systemic blind spots. In parallel, crash investigators analyzed the final moments of the aircraft's flight. The jet had exhibited predictable aerodynamic decay, losing stability gradually before entering an uncontrolled descent. Its rightward drift indicated asymmetric forces, possibly influenced by minor weight distribution imbalances or airflow disturbances caused by the missing canopy. Regardless, the aircraft's behavior aligned perfectly with aerodynamic expectations for an unpiloted F-16. The crash was violent, but inevitable. Without corrective inputs, no fighter aircraft can maintain stable flight for long. As the inquiry neared completion, discussions shifted to policy recommendations. Base commanders debated implementing mandatory brake engagement procedures during early cockpit preparation, establishing ground crew monitoring of cockpit behavior during ejection system arming, and rewriting checklists to emphasize conscious awareness of the ejection handle's position. Some proposals extended beyond procedure, suggesting modifications to the aircraft itself. But implementing structural changes across the entire fleet would require international coordination and significant investment. The Belgian Air Force also consulted with other NATO members, recognizing that the implications of the incident extended far beyond a single squadron. If such a scenario could unfold in Belgium, it could unfold anywhere fighter jets operated. Several Allied nations began reviewing their own ejection seat protocols, cockpit workflows, and ground handling procedures. The event became a catalyst for introspection across the alliance. On the base, the atmosphere remained subdued. Pilots and technicians spoke quietly about the incident, replaying the impossible sight of an aircraft accelerating and rising without a human inside it. Many struggled to reconcile their understanding of aviation with what they had witnessed. Fighter jets are built for precision, but precision still requires a guiding mind. Seeing that relationship severed so abruptly left a lingering sense of unease. In the final days of the investigation, the board focused on synthesizing the lessons in a way that could reshape policy and training. They recognized that the event was not just an anomaly. It was a defining case in aviation safety, one that would be studied for decades. It revealed that complex systems can harbor hidden vulnerabilities even when every component operates as intended. It demonstrated that accidental actions can trigger catastrophic chains not because the individual failed, but because the system lacked layers of protection around predictable human imperfection. When the last witness had been interviewed and every piece of wreckage cataloged, the investigation prepared to release its findings. They understood that the impact of their conclusions would echo not only in Belgium, but across air forces worldwide. Their work marked a turning point, a moment when aviation would be forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the most advanced machines rely on humans who are, by nature, imperfect. The final report was drafted with the weight of its implications fully understood by the investigators. Every line carried a lesson, every conclusion a warning. At its core, the document presented a stark truth. The accident was not the result of a single mistake, but of a system that had unintentionally normalized vulnerability. When the captain's hand made contact with the ejection handle, it was not merely an isolated slip. It was the moment when the entire ecosystem of cockpit design, human cognition, and procedural expectations intersected in the worst possible way. And that intersection exposed a reality that many had overlooked. Even the most advanced aircraft in the world were still profoundly dependent on the limits of human attention. As the findings circulated through Belgian Air Force leadership and NATO partners, the recommendations began to take shape. They focused first on procedural reforms. One change was straightforward but powerful: a mandatory brake engagement and verification protocol during all cockpit entry and strap-in procedures. This step would ensure that even if an ejection occurred unexpectedly, the aircraft would remain stationary, reducing the likelihood of taxi or roll movement. Another recommendation required ground crew to maintain visual contact with the cockpit during critical pre-flight phases, ensuring a second layer of observation that might detect unusual pilot posture or movements near the ejection handle. The report also encouraged refinements to checklists, emphasizing conscious recognition of the ejection handle's position before pilots began adjusting their harness or seat. This was a deliberate attempt to reintroduce mindfulness into a phase that pilots often performed on autopilot. Training syllabi were rewritten to include case studies on inadvertent control activation, reinforcing the idea that routine tasks are not immune to risk. But the most consequential discussions revolved around engineering solutions. Could the aircraft be modified to prevent accidental ground ejection? Could a simple interlock delay the seat's readiness until the pilot confirmed that the aircraft was in motion or airborne? Engineers debated these ideas extensively. Some argued for mechanical pins that would require removal before the ejection system became fully active. Others proposed weight sensors integrated into the seat, ensuring that only deliberate pressure from the pilot's hand combined with full body weight would trigger the sequence. But each proposal had trade-offs. A pin forgotten during a moment of high emergency would cost a pilot their life. A sensor miscalibrated could delay a life-saving action. As engineers weighed these risks, they understood that perfect safety was unattainable. Every safeguard introduced a new form of vulnerability. Nonetheless, the board recommended serious exploration of ground lock mechanisms for the future. While they could not mandate modifications to the existing fleet, they emphasized that future generations of fighter aircraft should incorporate measures preventing unintended ejection during non-emergency conditions. This recommendation would later influence design discussions for aircraft far beyond the F-16 lineage. The report also addressed the psychological resilience of pilots. Training programs began incorporating modules on cognitive drift, emphasizing that experience, while invaluable, can also create blind spots. Pilots were encouraged to adopt reset points during routine operations, brief pauses in which they consciously re-engaged their attention and re-evaluated their surroundings. These simple tactics, grounded in modern cognitive psychology, aim to reduce the likelihood of momentary lapses in high-risk environments. When the report was finally presented to the Belgian Ministry of Defense, it underscored a broader truth. Modern aviation was not simply about machines, but about the intricate relationship between humans and the systems they operate. The F-16 incident was a vivid example of what happens when a system assumes perfection from those who operate it. The investigation highlighted the need for redundancy not just in mechanical components, but in human-centered design, procedural vigilance, and organizational awareness. Public reaction to the report was as varied as it was intense. Some expressed disbelief that such an event had even been possible. Others saw it as a testament to how thin the margin of safety can be in military operations. Media outlets revisited the dramatic images of the pilot descending under his parachute while his aircraft rolled away. Headlines once again labeled it the ghost jet, the runaway fighter, the plane that took off alone. Yet behind the sensationalism was a growing appreciation for the complexity of the incident and the professionalism of the crew who had responded under impossible circumstances. Within the Belgian Air Force, the captain's fate became a delicate matter. Though he had survived, he carried the psychological burden of the incident with him. Evaluators ultimately cleared him to return to duty, acknowledging that he had followed established procedures and that the unintentional activation was a systemic failure, not an individual one. But the experience had changed him. Pilots often speak of the bond between themselves and their aircraft, a sense of unity forged through trust and mutual performance. For him, that bond had been shattered in an instant. The aircraft he had trained to master had slipped from his control not in a dogfight or storm, but in a moment of routine preparation. Time, however, brought perspective. As safety reforms took hold and training adapted, the captain saw how his experience had reshaped aviation culture not only in Belgium, but across multiple NATO air forces. The knowledge that future accidents might be prevented because of what he endured became a quiet source of resolve. Over the months that followed, he participated in several training seminars, sharing his story privately with younger pilots. His testimony was not a cautionary tale about failure. It was a lesson in humility, vigilance, and the inescapable reality that pilots, no matter how skilled, remain human. Beyond Belgium, the incident influenced the global evolution of cockpit resource management. CRM, once focused primarily on crew communication and multi-person coordination, expanded to include individual cognitive management during solitary cockpit operations, something fighter pilots experience daily. Procedural updates emphasize the interplay between human attention and cockpit ergonomics, ensuring that pilots approached even routine actions with deliberate focus. These refinements rippled outward into civilian aviation, where human factors research increasingly shaped everything from cockpit layout to checklist philosophy. Years later, the incident became a fixture in aviation safety lectures. In classrooms filled with aspiring pilots and engineers, instructors recounted the morning when an F-16 launched itself into the sky without a pilot. The story was not told to inspire fear, but to emphasize the profound responsibility carried by those who design, operate, and maintain complex machines. Students learned that accidents are rarely caused by spectacular failures. More often, they arise from the quiet convergence of small oversights, hidden assumptions, and unexamined vulnerabilities. The 1988 accident was a perfect embodiment of that truth. For the broader aviation community, the legacy of the event was clear. Systems must be designed to anticipate human error, not merely react to it. Procedures must acknowledge that even the best trained individuals are capable of momentary lapses. Organizations must remain vigilant in examining their cultures for signs of complacency, and engineers must balance the need for rapid, life-saving mechanisms with safeguards that protect against unintended activation. On Florennes Air Base, the memory of the incident lingered long after the runway was cleared and operations resumed. Some who had witnessed the jet's unpiloted takeoff described it as the most haunting moment of their careers. Not because of the crash itself, military aviation knows loss, but because of the surreal image of a machine breaking free from the human element that defines aviation. The sight had created a lasting reminder. Aircraft are not self-aware. They rely entirely on human intention, and when that intention is disrupted, even briefly, the machine will follow its programming without question or hesitation. In the final pages of the report, the investigators captured this lesson with clarity. They wrote that aviation is a partnership between humans and machines, but that partnership is vulnerable when assumptions go unchallenged. They noted that redundancy must exist not only in hardware, but in human-centered design, environmental awareness, and procedural clarity. And they concluded that the key to preventing future incidents was not perfection, but anticipation of error, distraction, routine, and the subtle ways in which they shape behavior. Years passed, but the lessons endured. The incident at Florennes became part of aviation's collective memory, a story retold whenever complacency threatened to erode discipline. Whenever pilots began to see routine as harmless, whenever engineers overlooked ergonomic fragility in pursuit of performance. It remained a permanent reminder that behind every flight lies a fragile balance between human judgment and mechanical power. And so, the skies carried forward a legacy born from a morning that began like any other. A moment of unintended contact, a blast of explosive force, a jet taking off without guidance, a narrow escape from catastrophe, and finally, a message etched into the history of aviation that safety is never static, never guaranteed, and never achieved through technology alone. It must be cultivated through awareness, vigilance, and the humility to learn from the moments when everything goes wrong. Every aircraft, from training jets to frontline fighters, carries this lesson into the air each time its wheels leave the ground. And every pilot who climbs into the cockpit does so with a renewed understanding of the truth revealed that morning in 1988, that even the smallest action can write a story across the sky, and that in aviation, every lesson, especially the painful ones, becomes part of the legacy that keeps the next flight safe.